The Corvette Navy by James B. Lamb. True stories from Canada's Atlantic War. Chapter 1. The Last Corvette. She lies alongside her wharf in front of the Maritime Museum on Halifax's busy waterfront. Yacht-like in her gleaming paintwork, and even to the most casual eye she is unique. A bright butterfly among the workaday shipping on every side. It's not just her bright coloring that sets her apart. That fat funnel, that raked mast, that duck-like stern give her a jaunty air quite unlike the business-like contours of the bulk carriers and container ships that throng the waterway, or the gray-hulled warships that sit in the naval dockyard. She is, in fact, a survivor from the distant past, sort of time capsule, and everything about her, from the white inside at her stern, the sweet caporal cigarettes, and the Liberty magazines in her canteen, are redolent of a bygone age. She is HMCS Sackville, once a Battle of the Atlantic veteran in the Second World War, now preserved as Canada's naval memorial, and famous the world over as the last corvette. She is the last survivor of the largest and most successful class of escort ships ever built. She and her sisters once made Canada one of the major naval powers in the world, and were the principal weapons that brought victory in the longest, bitterest, and most crucial battle of the war, thus ensured the survival of the free world. And as visiting classes and new recruits are told, traditions of their modern navy are found in her. It is appropriate that this last vessel should have lingered on in the Canadian wartime port, for the Corvette played a greater part in the growth and character of the Canadian Navy than it did in any other naval force, and its influence can be seen in the Canadian Naval Service to this day. More than any other ship, weapon, or aircraft, the Corvette had a distinctively Canadian connotation, her limitations and capabilities reflecting to a remarkable degree those of a new and growing Canadian Navy, so that she came to almost reflect the character of the men who sailed in her. For most corvettes and their crews were to blossom like so many Cinderellas from humble origins. Despised by the professional crews of regular Navy ships, they were destined to become belles de ball, the backbone of the victorious Atlantic escort fleet, and the developers of a tradition and their expertise uniquely their own, which was to be the envy of their regular Navy sisters. The Corvette was born in the Munch crisis of 1938, which convinced the board of the British Admiralty that war with Germany was inevitable and imminent. The Royal Navy began at once to gear itself for war by 1940, and its first requirement was for escorts to protect the huge and vulnerable overseas trade carried in British ships in every corner of the world. Existing types of warships were far too elaborate for quick production. Hundreds of escorts were needed that could be built and ready in a year's time. As it had in the First World War, the Admiralty turned to the well-known Middlesbrough shipbuilders, Smith Stocks Company, for a design suitable for emergency production. And again, this famous firm came through with an effective solution. The design proposed and the Admiralty accepted was based on the lines of a recently built whale-catching vessel called Southern Pride, that was more powerful engines and coincidentally greater speed. She was to be approximately 1,200 tons displacement, with an overall length of 205 feet, beam of 33 feet, and a draught of 15 feet. Driven by a single three-bladed propeller, she was to have a maximum speed of 60 knots and a really remarkable endurance of 4,000 miles at 12 knots on only 200 tons of oil fuel. Her machinery, four-cylinder triple expansion reciprocating engines of 2,750 horsepower and twin-cylindrical Scotch boilers, were deliberately kept simple for both ease of construction and of operations. The whole design was intended from the beginning to be capable of production by every sort of engineering firm other than the big ship builders, which were now crammed to capacity with large shipyard orders. Main armament of the new escorts was to be the depth charge, discharged from both traps in the stern and by mortars, throwers in the waist, and with surface armament of a single 4-inch gun and 2-pounder pom-pom, backed up by machine guns for anti-aircraft protection. Named Corvette, the French word for sloop, the new escort was, with its modest 47-man complement, was intended only as a stopgap until something better could be provided. But all unrecognized in these plans was a touch of genius. The doughty maid of all work had been endowed by her good fairy with a wholly unexpected rigid qualities, for the ship of humble design proved to be capable of amazing versatility, able to carry more than twice her designed complements, and a seemingly endless accumulation of ever more sophisticated armament and instrumentation. She could keep the sea in weather that overwhelmed huge merchant vessels and reduced destroyers to water-logged hulls. She could be used from anything from minesweeping to anti-aircraft protection. But the greatest blessing of all, she could turn on a dime. The only Allied warship was a turning circle tighter than that of the submarine. And she was the master of the U-boat in maneuvering duels that would foil any other service escort. Adaptable and flexible in an ever-changing war, the Corvette became the backbone of the Allied escort force, going through endless modifications and improvement in the course of building no fewer than 269 ships, the largest war class ever built. Ultimately, she evolved into a new class. Two sets of Corvette engines were jammed into a lengthened Corvette hull to gain a little more speed, and the resulting super Corvette was called a frigate. By the war's end, frigates and corvettes made up almost the entire strength of the Allied escort forces in the Atlantic, and the crews and reservists had brought the techniques of the convoy escort and submarine detection and destruction to new heights of expertise. But they also founded a tradition of colorful character and civic individualism, whirled away from the stereotype of the professional serviceman. Tradition cherished to this day in moments of nostalgia by elderly men in cities and towns across Canada. Right from the beginning, there's something suspect about Corvettes in the eyes of right-thinking professional Navy men. What was one to make of a man of war that looked like a fish trawler and called it HMCS Pansy? For the Admiralty, in a moment of inspiration, had designated the new ships as the Flower class. A tradition and escort vessels began in the First World War. Each Royal Navy corvette was named after a flower, and the world was enriched by sea-stained fighting ships glorying in the name of His Majesty's ship Pennywort, Crocus, or Tulip. There was a Convoyless, a Sackenfruge, and a Cowslip. But even the Board of Admiralty has a heart, eventually. HMC Pansy was allowed a change of name by a repentant ship's name committee. She became HMCS Heartsease. By the time the Royal Navy had built more than 100 corvettes, flower names were becoming difficult to come by. HMC Bulrush probably reflects the growing desperation of this latter period, while HMS Bulldog and HMS Ling showed just how far the Naming Committee was prepared to cast its net. In Canada, HMCS Poison Ivy was openly conceded to be a possibility, but cooler heads prevailed. Canadians decided to name their corvettes after towns and villages, though a handful of flower names, spikenard, snowberry, windflower, etc., were incorporated with ships originally built for the Royal Navy but taken over by the RCN. It was widely believed in the wartime Allied navies that the naming of the Flower class was part of a form of psychological warfare, practiced on the enemy by a vengeful Britain. There must be an added ignominy, it was felt, to be sunk by the HMS Poppy, as U-605 was, or to be outfought and captured by the fierce HMCS Handfif, as was the Italian submarine Peria. It was one thing to perish in the Wagnerian splendor hankered after by Hitler, but it was quite another for the proud Teuton to be vanquished by Rohedron as U-104 was, or sunk by Periwinkle like U-147. From the beginning, there was something fairly comic about corvettes, and it was an element of that their own crews were prepared to cherish and embellish as part of their jealously preserved attitude of enlightened amateurism in a world of professional insanity. The name of their ship was for the stockbrokers and student clerks and farmers who manned Violet and Gladius and La Marigold, a snook crooked at the whole professional establishment, and in particular the vainglorious German U-boats with their brass bands and "We are sailing against England" nonsense. There was nothing fancy about corvettes, either in their names or in their crews, and just the way the corvette men choose to have it. Although Canadian crews were spared the blushes of those who managed the HMS Pink or HMS Wallflower, they had a few names of their own that were considered a little peculiar. No one thought much of HMCS Obestos as a name for a fighting ship, while HMCS Nordics and HMCS Stonetown raised a few eyebrows in the escort ports. But by and large, corvette types took pride, however perverse, in their name of the ship, and they did their best to associate with the ship's crest, usually painted on the gun shield of the forward 4-inch. These designs, although they would have been despair of the Royal College of Heralds, were nonetheless lively, if not downright lurid. It would be hard to conceive of anything more apt than the 5 aces displayed on the crest of HMCS Bad Deck, more vivid than the crowned lady falling on her backside into a puddle on the gun shield of the HMCS Wet-Ass Queen. Whether named for flower or village, the corvettes and later these super corvettes, the frigates, were turned out in dozens by shipyards and engineering firms in Canada, some of whom had never before built a ship. More than 130 corvettes and half a hundred frigates were built in this country alone. And the British built even more, including ships for the French Navy and United States Navies. A trickle of the new corvettes began in Britain in 1940 and in Canada by the spring of 1941. Within a year, it had become a flood of fat-funneled, jaunty little ships. They grew to become a force that ruled the Atlantic. The seas were covered with them, and they clustered thick about the quays and Troy yachts in every naval port in the Northern Hemisphere. Today, they have disappeared as if they have never been. They serve only in the memories of aged men, and this single cherished veteran of a dockyard backwater. This is the story of that vanished fleet of ships, and of the colorful crews who sailed them across wartime North Atlantic.